Marcus Webb stood at the edge of his backyard, holding a Bud Light, watching other people enjoy his property. The Hendersons had been coming to his pool for 3 months now without permission. Not subtly, not occasionally. Every Saturday at 11 in the morning, like clockwork, Linda Henderson in her designer one-piece would lead her 2 teenagers and a rotating cast of friends through the iron gate Marcus had left unlocked once, months ago, when he'd been helping his neighbor move boxes. He'd mentioned it to Linda twice, kindly. The first time she'd laughed like he'd made a joke. The second time she'd smiled that particular smile women like Linda perfected, the one that said, "We both know you don't have the spine to actually do anything about this," and said, "Oh, Marcus, don't be silly. We're family-oriented people. The kids need to get out, you know. Everyone in the neighborhood comes to the Johnsons' place down the street. This is just so convenient." The Johnsons, of course she'd invoked the Johnsons. Marcus wasn't naturally confrontational. He was an accountant. He dealt in numbers and logic, in clean columns and predictable outcomes. People like Linda, HOA presidents with second homes and Range Rovers and opinions about everyone's landscaping, they operated on a frequency Marcus had never learned to match. His ex-wife had called it his catastrophic passivity. She'd left him for a divorce attorney with a boat and a voice that carried. So he'd done nothing about the pool intrusions. Not because he agreed, not because it didn't infuriate him, but because the cost of confrontation always seemed to exceed the benefit. And Linda Henderson had a way of making you feel small for even suggesting she was wrong. Until the Friday before everything changed. Marcus had been in his home office, a converted spare bedroom with a desk facing the window, when he saw Linda adjusting her sunglasses while her kids cannonballed into his pool. She was holding court with 2 other women he recognized from HOA meetings. He couldn't hear them through the glass, but he could read her gestures. She was gesturing toward his house, laughing. And then she'd mimed his face, a goofy, pathetic expression, a widower loser who couldn't figure out how to say no face. She'd looked directly at his window, knowing he was there, and she'd smiled. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat in his kitchen, drinking coffee at 2 in the morning, feeling something he hadn't felt since Catherine died 3 years ago, something besides the steady gray hum of depression. He felt anger, actual, clarifying, transformative anger. He decided to drain the pool. Not as a dramatic statement, not as confrontation. He simply decided if there was no pool, there was no problem. If there was no pool, Linda had nowhere to come. It was logical. It was clean. It was the kind of solution that appeared in a spreadsheet. He'd Googled drain residential pool and found that you didn't need professionals. You could do it yourself if you had a submersible pump and a hose. He'd ordered one for Saturday morning delivery. He'd spent Friday evening preparing the backyard, figuring out where to run the discharge hose, watching YouTube videos at 3 a.m. about proper drainage procedures. The delivery arrived at 8:15. The pump was heavy, industrial-looking. He got it connected by 9:30. He was about to fire it up when his phone buzzed. His sister, "How are you doing? Haven't heard from you in a week." He didn't respond, she'd only worry. By 10 o'clock, the pump was running. The water level was dropping visibly. Marcus stood at the shallow end with a cup of black coffee, watching the pool empty like his apartment after Catherine's funeral, people leaving, the space expanding, the silence deepening. The water kept dropping. By noon, the deep end was down to 6 feet. By 2 o'clock, the pool was draining below the normal operating range. The vinyl walls were starting to show that particular shade of faded blue-gray that looked like years of sun exposure. There was debris visible now, a few leaves, a child's toy. And something else. At the deep end, barely visible through the remaining 3 feet of water, something dark and geometric broke the surface of the pool floor. Something that didn't belong. Something that looked in shape and form like the curved edge of a roof. Marcus set down his coffee. He walked to the deep end and stood there, squinting down into the murk. The pump kept working, the water kept receding. More of the shape emerged. It was definitely not pool debris. It had the quality of something old, something that had been down there for a long time. He waited. The water dropped to 2 feet. Now he could make out detail. Metal, rusted metal, a windshield frame empty and gaping, chrome trim along the top edge, the distinctive rounded shape of a car. A 1920s Buick, maybe, or an Oakland. Buried under decades of silt and rust, compressed into the deep end of his swimming pool like some kind of archaeological grave. Marcus's hands went numb. He pulled out his phone. His fingers felt disconnected from his brain. He called the police non-emergency line and heard his own voice, calm and collected, the accountant's voice, the professional voice, explaining that he'd found human remains in his pool. He wasn't certain about the human part, but there was definitely a car that seemed to have been down there for decades. The officer who took the call put him on hold for what felt like 40 seconds but was probably 2 minutes. When she came back, her tone had changed. A car from the 1920s. Yes, I was draining the pool for, he stopped. He realized there was no explanation that made sense. I was draining the pool and found it. Stay at the property, don't touch anything, we're sending a unit. Marcus ended the call and just stood there, water draining around him, the exposed vinyl of his pool walls beginning to wrinkle under the open sun. The rusted car sat at the bottom like a dark secret finally brought to light. It didn't occur to him until later that evening, as police cars filled his driveway and officers began cordoning off the deep end with yellow tape, that draining the pool in response to the Hendersons had been exactly the right decision. Not for the reason he'd intended, but right nonetheless. By midnight, Marcus had given his initial statement to 3 different officers. The car had been documented, photographs taken, water samples collected. A representative from the county coroner's office had arrived and confirmed that, yes, there appeared to be human remains in the vehicle, skeletal, partially decomposed, mixed with silt and rust and decades of sediment. A detective named Sarah Chen, who looked like she'd been pulled away from dinner based on the faint tomato sauce stain near her collar, had asked him the same questions in slightly different orders until the answers came out exactly consistent. How long have you owned the property? 4 years. Did you know the pool was there when you bought it? Of course, it's an in-ground pool. It was fully functional. Any indication something was wrong with it? Any structural damage? Strange water quality issues? No, nothing. It was a perfectly normal pool. And you're draining it today because? I wanted to clean it, treat the vinyl. I do maintenance in the off-season. Detective Chen had a face that revealed nothing. On a Saturday, when you could have used a service. I prefer to do it myself. She'd looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression suggested she knew he was lying, or at least leaving something out. But she'd just written something in her notebook and moved on. By 2 in the morning, most of the police had left. A evidence tent had been erected over the deep end. The remains were being carefully extracted, cataloged, prepared for the coroner's examination. A detective would contact Marcus on Monday with an update. In the meantime, they were restricting his access to the pool area, as if he would go near it. Marcus sat in his living room, the television playing something he wasn't watching, and tried to reconcile the version of reality where he had a normal, quiet Sunday morning with the version where a corpse had been sleeping in his pool for possibly 60, 70, 80 years. At 4 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and went to his computer. He searched the county records, missing persons from the 1920s and 30s. He searched newspaper archives. Nothing jumped out. No obvious match. No car model precisely identified yet. Nothing but waiting. By Monday morning, his phone had buzzed with 3 texts from Linda Henderson. 9:47 p.m. Saturday. Heard sirens at your place. Everything okay? So scary when emergency vehicles are nearby. 7:23 a.m. Sunday. Still wondering if you're all right. We were planning to come by for a swim but saw the tape. Let us know if we can help. 6:51 a.m. Monday. Marcus, seriously, the suspense is killing me. Is everything okay? Call me. He did not call her. By Monday afternoon, Detective Chen appeared on his doorstep with updated information. The car had been identified as a 1926 Studebaker. The remains had been preliminarily identified as male, likely between ages 25 and 45. The cause of death was not immediately obvious. There were no obvious bullet holes, no visible blunt force trauma. But the skeletal analysis revealed something interesting. The victim's hands were bound, Chen said, standing in his living room with a small notebook. Rope fibers are still embedded in the radius and ulna bones, wrists crossed behind the back. The skull shows evidence of blunt force trauma, looks like a strike to the back of the head. Marcus felt the living room tilt slightly. So he was murdered. Murdered and dumped, Chen corrected. Either directly in the pool vehicle or the vehicle was placed in the pool after his death. Either way, someone went to significant effort to hide this body. But that was nearly 100 years ago. 99 years, Chen said. The Studebaker's registration number traces to a man named Marcus Holloway, owned by his family in this county from 1926 to 1931 when the paperwork stops. No accident report, no record of theft or disposal, just gone. She looked at Marcus directly. Do you know anything about the previous owners of your property, the people who lived here before you? No, I bought from an estate sale, an elderly woman. She'd lived here for, I don't know, decades. Her children didn't want to keep the house. The paperwork said she inherited it in 1967. Chen wrote that down. We'll be looking into the property history, talking to the county assessor, but here's what I want you to understand. Whatever happened here, it wasn't recent. You've uncovered a historical crime. This is good police work. She paused. What made you decide to drain the pool? Marcus considered lying again, considered the story that had almost worked the first time. Then he decided against it. My neighbor was using it without permission, he said. I was being too passive about it. I decided to do something about it. I needed a reason that wasn't confrontation. Draining it for maintenance seemed cleaner than asking them to stop. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, understanding. Well, she said, confrontation avoidance just solved a 99-year-old homicide. I'd say that worked out. After she left, Marcus sat alone in his living room for a long time. He thought about Marcus Holloway. He thought about whatever person or persons had beaten him, bound him, and dropped him in a pool at the bottom of a car. He thought about 99 years of secrets, sitting in the deep end, waiting. He thought about confrontation and avoidance, and the strange ways that life worked. And he thought about the fact that Linda Henderson's invasion of his privacy, and his decision to eliminate the evidence of it by draining the pool, had directly led to justice for someone dead nearly a century. He wondered if Holloway's family ever knew what happened to him. He wondered if they'd spent 99 years wondering, or if they'd stopped wondering sometime in the 1950s or 60s, worn down by the duration of not knowing. His phone buzzed. Linda, Marcus, I just heard from Patricia that the police found a car in your pool. This is insane. We need to talk about whether this affects the neighborhood's property values. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting. He muted his notifications and went to bed. Tomorrow, the real complications would begin. Tomorrow, the past would start to intersect with the present in ways nobody could have predicted. But tonight, Marcus Webb slept deeply for the first time in 3 years, knowing that sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to do the opposite of what you were expected to do, and that sometimes that opposite choice could alter everything. Even history. Detective Sarah Chen had been with the Homicide Division for 14 years, and in that time she had learned that every body told a story. The question was always how far back the story went, and whether anyone was still alive who wanted it told. The remains of Marcus Holloway had been carefully extracted from the Studebaker, which had taken 3 days of meticulous work by forensic teams. The car itself was being preserved and transported to a county facility for complete cataloging. But the skeleton, what remained of it, had become Chen's particular puzzle. The initial analysis confirmed what she'd told Marcus Webb. The victim had been struck on the back of the head with a blunt object, consistent with a hammer or pipe wrench. The blow would have been catastrophic. The bound wrists confirmed that he'd been restrained either before or shortly after the killing. The silt and sediment surrounding the remains suggested the body had been in the pool for the entire duration. No relocation, no fresh disturbance. But the forensic anthropologist, Dr. Richard Yost, had found something else, something that changed the profile of the crime. The victim has multiple healed fractures, Dr. Yost explained during a conference call that Chen patched through to her small desk in the station. Both arms, left clavicle, 3 ribs, all healed, all pre-mortem. Some of these injuries are years old. This was someone who experienced significant trauma throughout his life, not just the final blow. Chen made notes, accident-prone, or someone engaged in physical labor, or someone who lived a rough life. Could be any of those things, but the interesting part is the teeth. The teeth. The dental work, very poor quality, very distinctive. We can possibly match it to dental records if we can find them. But more importantly, the dental wear patterns suggest this individual was a laborer. heavy manual work. The temporomandibular joint shows significant degradation. This wasn't a desk worker. Chen thanked him and hung up. She pulled up the 1926 census records for the county and searched for Marcus Holloway. There he was, listed as a laborer, no specified trade, living on Meridian Street, which would become, in 1940, the exact address of Marcus Webb's current property. She started making calls to local historical societies. She contacted descendants. There were several Holloways still living in the county, spread across a few towns, their family trees branching out over generations. Most of them didn't remember Marcus. He was an ancestor from a distant generation, almost legendary in his disappearance. But his niece, Patricia Holloway Morse, now 92 years old and living in a care facility in the next county over, remembered something. Uncle Marcus was always getting into trouble, Patricia said, her voice thin and wary over the phone. Or at least that's what the family story was. He was the wild one. He had debts. He had money problems, and then one day he was just gone. Did anyone look for him? Of course they looked. The police came out, I remember that. I was only a girl, maybe 8 or 9. They said he'd probably run off. My mother thought he'd gone out west to start over. That was the kind of thing that happened then. People just left. You couldn't track them the way you can now. Do you remember anything else about him? Patricia was quiet for a long moment. There was a man. I remember my mother talking about him with my aunt, the man who owned the place where Uncle Marcus worked. I think my mother said he was a bad man. I think she said Uncle Marcus owed him money and the man was dangerous. But I was a child. I don't remember details. Chen's pulse quickened. What was the man's name? I don't know, it was so long ago. My mother's been dead for 30 years. If she knew, it's gone now. But it was something. It was a thread. Chen spent the next week following those threads. She pulled property records from 1926. The property where Marcus Webb now lived had been owned by a man named Victor Castellano. Castellano had purchased it in 1923 and had owned it until 1941, when he'd sold it to a woman named Elena Grip. Chen looked up Victor Castellano. He was a bootlegger, a mid-level player in the prohibition liquor trade. He had arrest records for alcohol distribution, tax evasion, and, interestingly, assault. In 1928, he'd been charged with assault against a man named Daniel Mayer. The charges had been dropped when Mayer failed to appear for trial. The Studebaker that they'd pulled from Marcus Webb's pool had been registered to Marcus Holloway. But the vehicle itself had an interesting history. The VIN number traced not just to Holloway, but to a loan document from 1925. Marcus Holloway had taken out a loan to purchase the car, financed through a private lender. The lender's name was Victor Castellano. When Chen saw that connection, she felt something click into place. Not the whole picture, not yet, but a frame, a structure, a context. She requested a meeting with Marcus Webb on a Wednesday afternoon. They sat in his living room again, but this time Chen had a file folder, photographs, historical documents. Your property has quite a history, she said, laying out the timeline. In 1926, when Marcus Holloway was 28 years old, he took out a car loan from Victor Castellano, a man with significant organized crime connections. The loan was for $950. That's approximately $20,000 in today's money. Marcus Webb just listened. Holloway worked as a laborer, primarily doing excavation work and construction. There's no indication he was earning enough to justify taking on that kind of debt. The question is, why did he need that car so badly? And more importantly, why would someone as dangerous as Victor Castellano loan money to a working-class laborer? You think the loan was a trap, Marcus said quietly. I think the loan might have been connected to other business, criminal business. Holloway might have agreed to do work for Castellano in exchange for the car, or the car might have been a way to make him indebted to create leverage. Chen pulled out another document. Victor Castellano's name appears in 4 different police reports between 1926 and 1932. None of the cases went to trial. None of the victims were willing to testify. But the pattern is consistent. Men who disappeared, or who suddenly stopped pressing charges, or who refused to cooperate with investigators. You think Castellano killed him? I think, Chen said carefully, that Castellano had the resources, the motive, and the history of violence to do it. Whether he personally pulled the trigger, or in this case, wielded the pipe wrench, is another question. But I think he ordered it or did it himself, and I think your pool was the convenient burial site." Marcus Webb stood up and walked to the window. His backyard was a crime scene in recovery. The pool still drained, the deep end cordoned off. Yellow tape still visible. The evidence tent still standing, though the forensic teams had mostly finished their work. "Why?" Marcus asked. "Why would he care enough about a single working man to do this?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Chen said. "I've been looking into what happened to Victor Castellano. He died in 1956. Car accident officially, drove off a bridge. Investigation was minimal. No evidence of foul play, but also no investigation into whether the accident might not have been an accident." "Vendetta?" "Possibly. Holloway had family. The family had to have known something, had to have suspected someone. If they suspected Castellano, it would take until 1956 to act on that suspicion, but people are patient when it comes to revenge." Chen paused. "I'd like to exhume Victor Castellano," she said. "I'd like to have his remains examined. His accident investigation file is thin. There's no autopsy report. It's possible his death was made to look accidental but wasn't. And if he was murdered, there might be evidence that connects his murder to Holloway's." "Can you do that?" Marcus asked. "Not without significant cause, but what I can do is find out if there are any descendants, any family members who might have knowledge about what happened." She found them 3 days later. Victor Castellano's granddaughter, Rosa Castellano Dimitri, was 65 years old and owned a restaurant in the northern part of the county. She agreed to meet with Chen on a Friday evening, after the restaurant had closed for the night. Rosa was a striking woman, with iron gray hair and a presence that suggested she'd never been pushed around by anyone, ever. She poured them both coffee in the restaurant's kitchen and sat across from Chen, with the directness of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for a long time. "My grandfather was a bad man," Rosa said simply. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I knew what he was. Everyone knew what he was. The only people who didn't know were the people who needed to not know, the police, the politicians, the businessmen who bought his product." "Did he kill Marcus Holloway?" Rosa didn't answer immediately. She looked at Chen for a long time, as if calculating something. "I was born in 1959, Rosa finally said. "That's after my grandfather's death, but I grew up hearing stories. My father wouldn't talk about it directly, but he let things slip. I understood that my grandfather had done something that resulted in his own death. I understood that it was karmic, that it was justice." "What did he do?" "He enslaved men," Rosa said bluntly. "He used debt to trap them. He used the prohibition business as cover for labor exploitation. Workers who couldn't pay what they owed were forced to work it off. If they tried to leave, there were consequences. He had people who handled that kind of thing." She stood up and walked to the restaurant's kitchen window, looking out at the empty dining room. "My father told me that my grandfather killed a man, that the man had tried to run, that my grandfather had beaten him to death and buried him where nobody would ever find him. My father said that karma took 40 years to work, but it got there eventually. My father said that was the law that actually mattered." "Why didn't anyone report it?" "Because in those days, in that community, you didn't report it. You didn't go to the police. The police were part of the system. You either accepted it or you waited for the universe to handle it or you handled it yourself. My grandmother, the wife, she made my father promise that he wouldn't pursue vendetta, that he wouldn't become like his father. She said that would mean letting the cycle continue." Rosa turned back to face Chen. "My father broke that promise," she said. "In 1956, he drove out to see his father. They fought. There was an accident, or it wasn't an accident. That's what he implied at the very end of his life when he was dying himself and confessing all his sins. He implied that his father's death was not accidental." "Did he kill him?" "I think," Rosa said carefully, "that he caused the conditions that led to the accident. I think he didn't intend for it to be a fatal accident. But I think he was okay when it turned out to be fatal. I think he was at peace with it." Chen wrote all this down. It wasn't legal evidence. It wasn't anything that would hold up in court. But it was truth of a kind. It was the story that explained the skeleton in Marcus Webb's pool. "I'd like to exhume your grandfather," Chen said. "I'd like to examine his remains, his autopsy report, the accident scene. I'd like to see if there's evidence that his death wasn't accidental." Rosa nodded slowly. "I don't have the authority to approve that, but I can tell you that I wouldn't oppose it. I think the truth should come out. I think my grandfather's actions created a wave of suffering that touched generations. I think knowing the full story of what happened might bring closure to the families who lost people to him. The exhumation of Victor Castellano took 2 weeks to arrange. The accident investigation from 1956 had been casual to the point of negligence, but there were photographs. There was a body, and there was an autopsy report that noted in clinical language that the victim had several injuries consistent with trauma both before and during the accident. The forensic analysis of Castellano's remains revealed something critical. He had been struck on the head with a blunt object before the accident. The injury was not consistent with an impact injury from a car crash. It was consistent with an intentional blow. The detective who had originally investigated the accident had noted this in the police report, and then filed it away, choosing to call it an accident anyway. In a later era, it might have been called a cover-up. In 1956, it was just how things were done. Chen compiled all of this into a report. She submitted it to the district attorney, who read it and then did something unusual. She called a press conference. After nearly a century, the DA announced, we have solved the murder of Marcus Holloway. The victim's remains were discovered on November 14th of this year in a residential pool in our county. The suspect, Victor Castellano, died in 1956, but evidence now suggests his death was not accidental as originally reported, but rather the result of violence inflicted by persons unknown, though we have strong reason to believe it was perpetrated by the victim's family as an act of delayed vendetta. The story exploded through the local news, then the regional news, because it was too good not to, the national news. A century-old murder solved by a man draining his swimming pool. A revenge killing 60 years later. A bootlegger and a laborer, a car in a pool. Marcus Webb's face appeared on the evening news. His quote, "I was just trying to deal with my neighbor," internet famous. People started making jokes about it. There were memes. There were think pieces about how sometimes doing the right thing by accident led to accidentally solving historical crimes. And then there were the complications. Marcus's neighbor, Linda Henderson, arrived at his house on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the discovery. She rang the doorbell, and when he opened it, she was holding her phone. "I want to apologize," she said simply. Marcus didn't know what to say. "I saw the news," Linda continued. "I saw what you were doing with the pool, and I realized that I invaded your privacy. I made assumptions about you. I treated you like you didn't matter. I'm sorry." She looked genuinely contrite, but Marcus had learned something in the past month. People could look genuinely contrite and still be people who invaded your space and mocked you when they thought you weren't watching. "Okay," he said. "I mean it," Linda said. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see how I was acting, and I'm sorry." After she left, Marcus sat in his living room and thought about what it meant to be right accidentally. What it meant to have your worst quality, your passivity, your inability to confront, turn out to be the thing that solved a murder. What it meant to be validated by circumstance instead of character. Detective Chen called him a week later with a final update. "We've closed the Holloway case," she said. "Official cause of death, homicide by blunt force trauma, perpetrator unknown. We're confident Victor Castellano was responsible, but since he's deceased and the evidence isn't strong enough for a posthumous conviction, it ends there. But the family got closure. That matters." "Does it?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Chen said. "It does. You'd be surprised how much closure matters, even when it comes 99 years late." After she hung up, Marcus thought about Marcus Holloway. He thought about what it meant to have your name finally called out loud again after decades of silence. He thought about the difference between being remembered and being forgotten. Then he looked at the pool, still drained, still cordoned off, still a crime scene in recovery, and realized that some secrets once exposed could never be put back where they belonged. The real complications were just beginning. True crime podcasters descended on the county. Local historians gave tour. Online communities speculated about the identity of Victor Castellano's killer, some convinced it was his own son, others arguing for mob connections, a few insisting it was a romantic rival or a business partner. The truth, as Rosa Castellano Dimitri had implied, was probably less dramatic and more intimate. A man finally breaking his promise to himself and his dead mother. But the armchair detectives didn't care about that version. They wanted conspiracy. They wanted mystery. They wanted the kind of story that would keep them engaged for weeks. Then someone from the County Historical Society reached out to Marcus Webb. Her name was Dr. Patricia Morrow, and she had the precise energy of someone who had spent her life studying the past and was thrilled to have a real, tangible connection to her research. She appeared at his door with a folder of documents, a laptop, and an enthusiasm that was impossible not to catch. "What you've discovered," Dr. Morrow said, spreading her documents across his kitchen table, "is not just a crime scene. It's a historical site. Your property is sitting on layers of history. The Studebaker alone is an automotive treasure. The pool, the house itself, the way the crime was concealed for nearly a century, it all tells a story about this community and the era it represents." Marcus made coffee. Dr. Morrow pulled out photograph after photograph of the Studebaker being excavated, cataloged, preserved. She showed him documents from the 1920s, newspaper articles, census records, property transfers. She painted a picture of a community that had existed in a moment between eras, modern enough to have cars and electricity, but still operating under social systems that belonged to the previous century. "What I'd like to propose," Dr. Morrow said carefully, "is a full archaeological survey of your property, not just the pool area but the entire lot. I suspect your house might be sitting on an older structure. There's historical evidence that someone, probably Victor Castellano or one of his associates, did significant excavation work in the 1920s and 30s. I suspect there might be other artifacts, other layers of history buried here." "Why would you want to dig up my entire property?" "Because the past has a way of revealing things if you look carefully enough," Dr. Morrow said. "And because what's been revealed so far is just the surface. Beneath that surface, I suspect there's evidence of labor, exploitation, the hidden economy that kept this area functioning during Prohibition. I suspect your property might have served multiple purposes for people like Victor Castellano." Marcus considered this. He thought about his pool, drained and exposed. He thought about what it felt like to have your private space invaded, not by the Hendersons, but by history itself. "I'd want to control it," he said. "I don't want my house turned into a circus." "Fair enough," Dr. Morrow agreed. "We can do this quietly. Weekdays only, small team, no public access until we have something to report." The archaeological survey began on a Monday in early December. A team of 4 arrived with ground-penetrating radar equipment, carefully marked grids, and the kind of methodical precision that Marcus found oddly soothing. He watched from his back window as they worked, moving slowly across his property, measuring, recording, imaging the earth beneath his feet. By Thursday, they'd found something. Dr. Morrow appeared at his door with barely contained excitement. "We've discovered evidence of a buried structure beneath the northwest corner of your yard. The ground-penetrating radar shows what appears to be a basement or underground room. It's approximately 15 feet below the current ground level." "How long has it been there?" "At least 80 years, possibly longer. The fill above it is consistent with mid-1920's construction techniques. I suspect it was deliberately buried and concealed." "What was it?" "That's what we need to excavate to determine. With your permission, I'd like to expand the dig." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a sense that the surface of his private life was being carefully peeled back, layer by layer, revealing what had been hidden beneath the whole time. "Okay," he said. The excavation took 3 weeks. What they found was the remains of a Prohibition speakeasy. The buried structure had been a basement, built into a hillside, accessed through an entrance that had been sealed and concealed when the structure was buried. Inside, the team discovered bottles, hundreds of bottles, many still intact, many with labels identifying them as whiskey, gin, and vodka from the 1920s. They found the remains of a bar made from salvaged wood. They found tables, chairs, a piano bench without a piano. They found glasses, some broken, some perfectly preserved after 70 years in the earth. And they found a ledger. The ledger was water-damaged but largely legible. It contained names, dates, amounts owed, amounts paid, amounts defaulted. It was Victor Castellano's record of his customers' debts, a chronicle of who owed him money and how they were paying it off. Marcus Holloway's name appeared 17 times in the ledger, spanning from March 1926 to August 1926. The amounts were large and grew progressively larger. Against his final debt, someone had written in red ink, "Paid in blood." Dr. Morrow sat across from Marcus in his living room, holding the ledger carefully, and said, "I think I understand what happened now." She walked him through it. Victor Castellano had run his speakeasy from the buried basement, a private club for people with money and access. Marcus Holloway had worked for him, probably as labor for the ongoing construction and maintenance of the space. But Holloway had also been drinking there, had been gambling there, had been accumulating debts that he couldn't pay. The car loan had been a trap, but not in the way Chen had initially theorized. The car loan had been an attempt to give Holloway a way out, to give him collateral he could work off his debt with. But Holloway had still owed money when he died. And whoever killed him, whoever wrote that annotation in red ink, paid in blood, had decided that blood was the only acceptable payment left. "The ledger is going to change the historical record," Dr. Morrow said. "This is evidence of organized labor exploitation, of how debt was weaponized, of the violence that underlay the economic systems of that era. This is more than a crime. This is a window into a hidden world." She paused. "I'd like to preserve your property as a historical site," she said carefully. "I know that's a lot to ask, but what you have here, what we found here, it's important. It's educational. It's a record of American history that usually stays hidden." Marcus thought about that. He thought about his pool, drained and cordoned off. He thought about his backyard becoming a permanent monument to a crime committed before he was even born. He thought about the difference between privacy and history, between a home and a crime scene. "Not permanently," he said, "but I'll consider it. I need time to process what's here, what it means." That night after Dr. Morrow left, Marcus sat on his back porch and looked at the evidence markers still dotting his yard. He thought about the fact that he'd bought this property 3 years ago, after Catherine died, looking for something that felt stable and real and permanent. He'd bought this house as a refuge, and instead it had turned out to be a grave. His sister called. She'd been calling more frequently since the news of the discovery had broken. She was worried about him, he knew. Worried that he was being exploited by journalists and historians and the endless appetite of the internet for compelling narratives. "How are you really?" she asked, the way sisters do when they want you to cut through the social niceties and tell the truth. "I don't know," Marcus said. "I'm living in a historical site now. My property is where a man was murdered nearly a century ago. I was trying to solve a neighbor problem, and instead I solved a crime. I don't know how to process that." "You could sell," his sister said gently. "You could move, you could start over." Marcus considered that. It was the sensible option, the accountant's option, liquidate the asset and move on to something less complicated. "I don't think I'm going to," he said. "I think I'm going to stay. I think I'm going to let this history be part of my history. I think I'm going to let this property become what it needs to become." His sister was quiet. "That's very unlike you." "Yeah," Marcus said. "It is. Maybe that's the real change that happened here, not solving the crime, not discovering the speakeasy, but becoming someone who can sit with complicated things instead of running from them." In the new year, Marcus agreed to let Dr. Morrow establish a historical marker on his property. The city approved it, and in February, on a cold Saturday morning, an official historical plaque was installed in his front yard, explaining in official language what had been discovered here and why it mattered. The Hendersons came by while the installation was happening. They watched from their driveway. Linda didn't come over to apologize again. That moment had passed. But she looked at the plaque and then at Marcus, and something shifted in her expression. Recognition, maybe. Understanding that his passivity had contained within it a kind of strength. The strength to let things be revealed, to let secrets emerge, to not fight against the truth. By spring, the archaeological team had finished their work. The buried basement was carefully resealed and protected. The ledger was being digitized and would eventually become part of a county museum collection. The Studebaker had been restored as much as possible and was being preserved in a climate-controlled facility. Marcus had the pool refilled. It seemed wrong to leave it empty forever, as if the crime itself had to be memorialized by drainage. He wanted his backyard to be a place where people could live again, even if that life was shaped by what lay beneath it. One evening in May, as the sun was setting and the water in his pool was catching the last light, Marcus sat at the shallow end and thought about Marcus Holloway. He thought about a man who had wanted something he couldn't afford, who had made a deal with someone dangerous, and who had paid the ultimate price for that decision. He thought about 99 years of waiting in the dark. He thought about finally being found. And then he went inside and picked up his phone to call his sister. "I want to have you over for a pool party," he said. "I want to invite people. I want to do something with this property that's about life, not just about what died here." By July, the pool was a regular gathering place again. But it was different now. Everyone who came understood that this was a place where history had been excavated, where secrets had been revealed, where the past and present intersected in ways that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. It was no longer just a pool. It was a monument. It was a reminder. And Marcus Webb, the accountant who'd wanted everything clean and organized and simple, had become the keeper of a story too complicated to ever fully explain. By August, Marcus Webb had been interviewed by 23 different journalists. A true crime podcast had dedicated an entire season to the Marcus Holloway case, and his face had appeared on Reddit so many times that he'd stopped Googling his own name. The one thing that had not changed was the fundamental solitude of knowing what he now knew. The woman who came to his house on the first Tuesday of August was Dr. Elizabeth Thorne, a forensic historian from the State University. She'd written a book about Prohibition-era violence, and she wanted to focus a second edition on the Marcus Holloway case. She wanted Marcus's exclusive story. "Not just the discovery," Dr. Thorne explained, sitting in his living room with the same methodical attention that Dr. Morrow had brought. "I want your psychological journey. I want the interior experience of discovering that your home is built on a crime. I want to understand how it's changed you." Marcus didn't want to be understood. He wanted to be left alone. But he was beginning to learn that wanting and getting were not always aligned, and that sometimes the best thing you could do was cooperate with the inevitable. "I haven't changed," Marcus said carefully. "Not fundamentally. I've integrated new information, that's all." "That's not true," Dr. Thorne said, not unkindly. "You've changed profoundly. You were passive before, now you're engaged. You were withdrawn. Now you're opening your home to scholars and historians. You were alone. Now you're part of a narrative larger than yourself." She was right, and Marcus hated that she was right. After she left, he sat in the darkness of his living room and tried to remember what passivity had felt like. It had felt like numbness, he recalled. It had felt like existing without really being alive. For 3 years after Catherine died, he'd been a ghost moving through a ghost house. The Hendersons invading his pool had been an irritation barely registering against the weight of his grief. Now, 5 months after finding the car, the weight had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, but it was different. It had structure now. It had shape. It was bearable because it was shared, not with anyone he'd chosen, but with history, with the people who'd lived here before him, with Marcus Holloway's ghost and Victor Castellano's ghost, and all the ghosts that lived in the spaces beneath the surface. His therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Lynn, who he'd started seeing in March at his sister's gentle insistence, had said something interesting during their last session. "Sometimes trauma is isolating precisely because we think we're unique in our suffering. We think we're the only ones who have experienced something. But what if you're wrong? What if you're actually connected to centuries of people who have experienced similar pain?" "That doesn't make it better," Marcus had said. "No," Dr. Lynn agreed. "But it makes it less isolating. It makes it part of human experience instead of your individual failure." That conversation had been in his mind when he agreed to let Dr. Thorne work with him, when he agreed to let documentary filmmakers come to his house, when he agreed to participate in the Historical Society's plans to make his property an official site of archaeological and historical significance. He was choosing connection. He was choosing to stop being alone with his secrets. But choosing connection didn't mean the weight disappeared. It just meant the weight was shared. In mid-August, he received a letter from Rosa Castellano Dimitri. "Dear Mr. Webb, I hope this finds you well. I've been following the discoveries on your property with great interest, and I wanted to reach out to you directly. The ledger that was found in the buried basement contains my grandfather's handwriting. I have no doubt of that, and I want you to know that the annotation, paid in blood, was his. I believe my grandfather wrote that himself, as a record of what he had done. I believe he kept it as a way of documenting his own crimes. This is a man who rationalized murder as business. He kept ledgers to prove that everything could be calculated, that everything had a price, that life could be reduced to numbers on a page. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. You didn't choose to live on top of a crime. But my family chose to commit that crime, to hide it, to build structures around concealing it. The fact that it's now revealed, that it's now part of historical record, that people like Marcus Holloway are no longer hidden and forgotten. I think that's a kind of justice that transcends law. I want you to know that my family accepts the weight of what was done here. We accept our connection to it. And I want to help you carry the weight of knowing what was done here if you'll let me. Sincerely, Rosa Castellano Dimitri. Marcus read the letter 3 times. On the 4th reading, he started crying. Not hard, not dramatically, but with the quiet, resigned kind of tears that come from carrying something heavy for too long and finally being allowed to set it down, even if just for a moment. He called Rosa. "Thank you," he said when she answered. "Thank you for writing that. Thank you for acknowledging it." "Don't thank me," Rosa said. Her voice was warm but without excess sentiment. "Just take care of yourself, take care of this place. Let it be what it needs to be." They talked for 2 hours. She told him about her grandfather, about her father, about the ways that violence rippled through families across generations. She told him about the burden of inherited guilt, the strange responsibility of being born into a family that had done terrible things. "But here's what I've learned," Rosa said. "The only way to break the cycle is to acknowledge it, to say, yes, this happened and these are the consequences. My father almost broke the cycle. He almost let himself become his father by pursuing vendetta, but he stopped himself. He chose not to continue the pattern, and that's how you break it, by choosing." After they hung up, Marcus sat in the darkness and thought about choices. He thought about the choice he'd made to drain the pool, a choice motivated by avoidance and passivity that had somehow led to the exposure of truth. He thought about the choices Victor Castellano had made, choices that had led to an empire of exploitation built on the backs of people like Marcus Holloway. He thought about Rosa's father, choosing not to become his father, choosing to break the cycle even if that meant violence. He thought about his own choices now, the choice to stay in this house instead of running, the choice to cooperate with historians instead of resisting, the choice to open himself to connection instead of hiding in grief. These felt like bigger choices than the choice to drain a pool. In September, Marcus agreed to something he never thought he would agree to. He allowed a documentary crew to film him walking through the excavated areas of his property, discussing what had been found and what it meant. He allowed them to film him standing at the pool's edge, talking about Marcus Holloway. He allowed them to film him working with historians to interpret the ledger. And when the documentary premiered at a film festival in October, Marcus went. He sat in a theater full of strangers and watched his own face on a screen, watched himself articulate things he hadn't known he understood until the camera was pointed at him. He watched the story unfold. The pool, the car, the murder, the speakeasy, the ledger, the circle of violence and debt and exploitation that had been finally broken by someone as unlikely as a grieving widower who just wanted his peace back. After the screening, a woman approached him. She was older, probably in her 70s, with gray hair and tired eyes, and the particular look of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time. "My name is Eleanor Holloway," she said. "I'm Marcus Holloway's great-granddaughter." Marcus didn't know what to say. "I never met him," Eleanor continued. "He died 60 years before I was born, but my grandmother, his daughter, she kept talking about him. She kept saying that he disappeared, that nobody knew what happened to him. She spent her whole life wondering. She died not knowing." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for finding him. Thank you for making sure people knew his name. Thank you for not letting him be forgotten." She hugged him right there in the theater lobby, and Marcus, who had spent years being unable to feel anything, had spent years numb with grief, felt something break open in his chest. Tears came. They came like they'd been held back for decades. They came for Marcus Holloway. They came for Eleanor's grandmother. They came for all the people who'd waited for a truth that took nearly a century to arrive. When Eleanor left, Marcus sat alone in the lobby for a long time. He thought about legacy. He thought about what it meant to be connected to history, to be the person through whom the forgotten were finally remembered. He thought about the fact that Catherine, his dead wife, never would have believed that this was where he'd end up. Catherine, who had said he was incapable of confrontation, who had left him for someone with a stronger voice and a louder presence. Catherine, who had underestimated the power of passive acceptance to eventually lead to active transformation. He picked up his phone and texted his sister, "I need to see you. I need to have dinner with you. I need to remember what it feels like to be part of a family that's still alive." The dinner happened on a Saturday in November. almost exactly 1 year after Marcus had drained the pool. His sister brought her husband and their 2 children. They sat around Marcus's dining room table, a table that, just a year ago, would have seemed impossibly isolating to fill with people. Now it felt full in the way tables were supposed to feel full. It felt alive. His sister looked at him with the particular expression that sisters reserve for brothers who have finally grown up. "You did good," she said simply. "You didn't mean to, but you did good. You solved a mystery. You honored someone who deserved to be honored. You transformed your loss into purpose." Marcus didn't correct her. He let her believe that he'd done it intentionally, that there was agency in what had happened. Because maybe there was. Maybe the intention was less important than the outcome. Maybe the fact that something good had emerged was enough, regardless of whether the emergence had been accidental. After his family left, Marcus sat in his living room and looked at the walls of his house. He thought about all the people who had lived here before him. He thought about Victor Castellano building his empire in the basement. He thought about Eleanor Grip buying the property and never knowing what lay beneath her feet. He thought about all the previous owners, all the previous lives, all the sediment of history piling up. And he thought about the fact that, for better or worse, he was part of that history now. His passivity, his avoidance, his simple decision to drain a pool had intersected with destiny. He was the person through whom the hidden had been revealed. He accepted that. He let it settle into his bones, into his understanding of who he was and what he was capable of. And then, on the first day of December, he made a decision. He called Dr. Patricia Morrow and told her what he wanted to do. "I want to open the property to the public," he said. "Not full-time, but weekends. I want people to come here and learn about Marcus Holloway. I want people to understand what exploitation looked like in that era. I want this place to be a monument to the forgotten." Dr. Morrow was silent for a long moment. "Are you sure?" "No," Marcus said, "but I'm doing it anyway. I think that's been the real lesson here, not about confrontation or passivity or any of the things I thought I'd learned. The real lesson is that sometimes you have to do things you're not sure about because they're right, not because you understand them." By spring, the Marcus Webb Historical Site had opened to the public on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. There was a small museum set up in a converted space, with reproductions of the ledger, photographs from the excavation, biographical information about Marcus Holloway and Victor Castellan, and the whole constellation of people whose lives had intersected in violence and debt and exploitation. People came from across the state to visit. Some came because they were interested in Prohibition history. Some came because they were interested in the mechanics of crime solving. Some came, like Eleanor Holloway, because they had family connections to the tragedy and needed to see the place where their history had been made. And Marcus was there on those weekends, answering questions, telling the story, helping people understand what had happened in the earth beneath their feet. He was no longer the man he had been. He was no longer invisible. Winter came and went. By spring, the Marcus Webb Historical Site had become a small but significant draw for the county. But success brought complications that Marcus hadn't anticipated. The State Historical Preservation Board wanted to purchase the property and convert it into a full-time museum. They offered him more than market value. It was a sensible offer. It was the kind of offer that the old Marcus, the grieving, passive Marcus, might have accepted without hesitation, grateful for a way out. But Marcus had changed. "I don't want to sell," he told the board representative, a woman named Catherine Voss who seemed genuinely puzzled by his refusal. "But the property would be preserved," Catherine argued. "It would be protected from development. It would become a permanent educational site." "It's already those things," Marcus said. "While I own it, I don't need to sell it for that to be true." "What's the complication?" Catherine asked, not unkindly. "Most people in your situation are grateful for the opportunity to be relieved of the burden." Marcus sat with that word. Burden. His property, his house, the place where he'd come to live after his wife died, it was being described as a burden that he should be grateful to be relieved of. "The complication," Marcus said carefully, "is that this is my home. The Marcus Holloway case is not something separate from my life. It's not something I'm preserving on behalf of someone else. It's part of my inheritance. It's part of what I live with every day. I don't want to be relieved of that." Catherine left without the property. But the incident crystallized something for Marcus. He realized that his resistance to selling wasn't about sentiment, though there was some of that. It was about ownership. It was about the fact that he'd been passive for so long, allowing other people to make decisions about his life, and now, finally, he was making decisions himself. He called Rosa Castellano Dimitri again. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About breaking cycles, about acknowledging inherited guilt. I want to propose something." He laid out his idea. Rosa listened without interrupting. "I want to create a scholarship fund," Marcus said. "I want to use some of the money I've made from giving tour and from the documentary rights to help young people from working-class backgrounds get education. I want to help people who are in the position Marcus Holloway was in, people without resources, people who have to make deals with dangerous people just to get what they need." "That's beautiful," Rosa said. "It's not beautiful because it's good," Marcus said. "It's beautiful because it's the only way I know how to break the cycle, too. It's the only way I know how to make sure that what happened to Marcus Holloway doesn't keep happening." Over the next 6 months, the scholarship fund was established. It was small at first, only enough to help 3 students per year. But it grew. Dr. Patricia Morrow contributed a grant. Eleanor Holloway, Marcus's great-granddaughter, established a permanent endowment in her great-great-grandfather's name. Even Catherine Voss, the state representative, contributed on behalf of the Historical Preservation Board. By the time the first cohort of scholarship recipients arrived on campus that fall, the fund had grown to enough to help 10 students per year. One of them was a young man named David Kim, 19 years old, the first person in his family to go to college. He came from a working-class community 30 miles away. His family owned a small manufacturing business that was struggling. He'd been working full-time and going to school part-time when he received notice that he'd been selected for the Marcus Holloway Memorial Scholarship. He came to meet Marcus. "I want to understand the person I'm named for," David said, sitting in Marcus's kitchen. He was nervous, uncertain, but determined. "I want to know what the scholarship means beyond just the money." Marcus walked him through it. He told him about Marcus Holloway's life, about how debt had enslaved him, about how the scholarship was meant to prevent that kind of slavery from continuing. He told him about the choice to pursue education, to pursue freedom, to pursue something beyond what circumstances dictated. "The scholarship is named for someone who didn't get those choices," Marcus said. "It's meant for people like you, people who have to make choices in the real world, who have to work while you study, who have constraints that privileged people never have to think about. It's meant to say, you matter. Your education matters. Your future matters." David's eyes filled with tears. "I've been so afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid that I'm not smart enough, afraid that I'll fail, afraid that my family will have wasted their money on me." "They haven't," Marcus said. "And you're not going to fail. You're going to finish your degree and you're going to do something important with your life. Because people like you, people who have had to fight for everything, you have a kind of strength that people born into privilege never develop." David graduated 4 years later with a degree in urban planning. He came back to see Marcus, diploma in hand. "I want to work on community development," David said. "I want to help communities like the one I came from. I want to build things, good things, things that matter." Marcus looked at this young man, this person who represented what the scholarship fund was meant to create, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just peace, but the sense that his life, his pain, his inheritance had been alchemized into something generative. The years passed. By 2030, 5 years after Marcus had drained the pool, the site had become a significant historical landmark. The Studebaker had been completely restored and was on permanent display. The ledger had been digitized and was available in archives at universities across the state. The buried speakeasy had been preserved and carefully protected beneath the property, accessible to scholars but not to the casual visitor, a reminder that some secrets were meant to stay underground, even after being discovered. Marcus's hair had turned completely gray. He was 61 years old. He'd hired a part-time staff to help run the tour on weekends. He'd written a memoir about the experience of discovering the crime. The memoir had been moderately successful, published by a small university press, reviewed favorably by academics, but not a bestseller. Not the kind of book people talked about at dinner parties. He preferred it that way. Eleanor Holloway visited regularly. She was in her 40s now, a librarian in the city, and she'd become friends with Marcus in the way people become friends when they've shared something profound. She'd brought her own children to the site. showing them their great-great-great-grandfather's legacy. "He would have liked this," Eleanor said once, sitting at the pool's edge just as Marcus often did. "He would have liked knowing that his story mattered, that people cared enough to remember him." "We can't know that," Marcus said, "but I like to believe it. I like to believe that consciousness persists somehow, that the dead know when they've been acknowledged." "That's not very rational," Eleanor said. "No," Marcus agreed, "but I've learned that rational is only one way of being true. There are other truths, too." On the 10th anniversary of the discovery, the county held a special commemoration. There was a ceremony at the site. Eleanor Holloway spoke about her family. Rosa Castellano Dimitri spoke about the cycle of violence and the possibility of redemption. Detective Sarah Chen spoke about justice delayed but not denied. And Marcus spoke about what it meant to live on top of history, to live with the weight of the past, to choose to carry that weight consciously instead of burying it. "I didn't expect to be here," he said to the crowd gathered in his backyard. "I didn't expect to find a car. I didn't expect to find a speakeasy. I didn't expect to become a guardian of a historical truth. I expected my life to be quiet. I expected my life to be small. But I learned something important. Quiet doesn't mean nothing is happening. Small doesn't mean insignificant." He paused. Marcus Holloway was a small man, a laborer, a person without power or resources, but his death, his murder, his burial, his eventual discovery, that changed history. That taught people something about how the world actually works beyond the official stories. That created the possibility of making things better. He looked out at the people gathered. Eleanor, Rosa, Dr. Morrow, Detective Chen, the scholarship recipients who'd come back to speak about their lives. He looked at the place that had become a monument to the forgotten. "We're all like that," he said. "We're all Marcus Holloway in some way. We're all going to be forgotten eventually, unless we choose to matter while we're alive. Unless we choose to acknowledge what matters to us. Unless we choose to carry the weight of the past forward into the future." After the ceremony, people lingered. They walked through the museum. They looked at the pool. They asked questions about excavation and history and the mechanics of solving century-old crimes. As the sun was setting, Marcus sat alone at the pool's edge, watching the water catch the last light. He thought about the fact that somewhere in the ground beneath him, the buried speakeasy still existed, carefully sealed, carefully protected, a secret that wasn't quite secret anymore but was still hidden. He thought about Marcus Holloway, finally remembered after 99 years. He thought about how his own life had intersected with Holloway's, how his passivity had led to confrontation, how his grief had transformed into purpose. He heard footsteps and turned to see his sister approaching. "You did it," she said, sitting beside him at the pool's edge. "You made it mean something." "I'm not sure I did it deliberately," Marcus said. "I think I just fell into it." "That's how life works for most people," his sister said. "We're passive, we react to circumstances, and then one day we look back and realize we've created something, we've built something, we've mattered." They sat in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon. "What are you going to do now?" his sister asked. Marcus considered the question. He was financially secure. The book had done well enough. The scholarship fund had taken on a life of its own. The site ran itself, mostly. He didn't need to work anymore. "I'm going to keep the pool open to the public," he said. "I'm going to keep telling the story. I'm going to keep helping kids like David Kim. And I'm going to try to live with the weight of what I've inherited without letting it crush me." "That's good," his sister said. "It's not extraordinary," Marcus said. "It's just life lived consciously, lived with intention." "Maybe that's all extraordinary ever is," his sister said. They stayed until full dark fell, and the stars became visible above them. The pool reflected them, doubling the stars, multiplying the light. In the distance, in the homes beyond the property, lights came on. People settling in for the evening, normal lives, quiet lives, the kind of lives Marcus had wanted before the car emerged from the bottom of his pool. He still wanted them sometimes, but he'd learned to want other things too. He'd learned that quiet didn't preclude significance, that passive acceptance could coexist with active transformation. That sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to make sure they were finally, forever remembered. 20 years after the discovery, Marcus Webb was 81 years old. His hair was white, his hands shook sometimes. He didn't walk as fast as he used to, didn't have the energy for full days of giving tour. But he still came to the site on weekends, still stood at the pool's edge, still watched the water catch the light. The Marcus Holloway Historical Site had become a significant academic resource. Dozens of dissertations had been written using the archive. University classes took field trips to the property. School children learned about it as part of local history curricula. The scholarship fund had helped 300 students pursue higher education. David Kim, the first recipient, was now a city planner with a significant reputation. He'd built affordable housing communities. He'd worked on urban renewal projects. He'd lived out the promise that the scholarship was meant to create. Eleanor Holloway had retired from her job as a librarian. She'd become a historian in her own right, specializing in the lives of working-class people lost to history. She'd written a book about her great-great-grandfather and the men like him, forgotten laborers swallowed by circumstance and violence. Rosa Castellano Dimitri had passed away at 91. Her children had continued her work, opening the Castellano family archives to scholars, funding scholarships in her grandfather's name, not as redemption because no amount of charity could redeem that kind of violence, but as acknowledgement. As a way of saying, yes, this happened. Yes, my family was part of this. Yes, we're trying to be better. On a Saturday in October, the anniversary of the discovery now commemorated annually, a young woman came to visit the site. She was a graduate student at the State University, working on her dissertation about the intersection of material culture and social violence. She'd come to study the ledger. Marcus helped her access the archives. He answered her questions about the Studebaker, about the speakeasy, about the whole constellation of events that had led to discovery. What was it like, she asked as they sat in the small museum, to find that, to have your home become this? Marcus considered the question. He'd answered it many times over the years, but it never felt settled. It never felt like there was a final answer. It was like drowning, he said finally. And then learning how to breathe underwater. You don't choose it. You don't plan for it. But once it happens, you adapt or you die. And since I chose to adapt, I got to discover that there's actually a kind of life possible in depths I never expected to explore. The young woman wrote that down. After she left, Marcus sat alone in the museum. He looked at the photographs of the Studebaker before and after restoration. He looked at the reproductions of the ledger pages. He looked at the biographical information about Marcus Holloway. And then he did something he did every now and then when he was alone. He let himself imagine what it would have been like if things had gone differently, if he'd never bought the property, if he'd never had the impulse to drain the pool, if Linda Henderson's invasion of his space had simply remained an irritation instead of becoming a catalyst. In that version of events, Marcus Holloway remained undiscovered. The Studebaker stayed buried. The secret stayed secret. But something else would have happened instead. The cycle would have continued elsewhere. Some other injustice would have remained hidden. Some other truth would have been buried. The question wasn't whether the discovery was meant to happen. The question was whether he'd been the right person to discover it, and whether his life, his passivity, his grief, all of it, had been the necessary context for the discovery to mean something. He liked to believe the answer was yes. He liked to believe that nothing was wasted, not even the years of depression after Catherine's death, not even the humiliation of having neighbors use his pool without permission. He liked to believe that all of it had led somewhere. All of it had meant something. As evening fell, Marcus locked up the museum and walked to the pool one last time that day. The water was calm, reflecting the darkening sky. There were no secrets in it anymore. The car had been removed, the body had been buried with proper ceremony, the speakeasy had been catalogued and preserved. But the pool remained. It remained as a monument, as a mirror, as a reminder that the past lived beneath the surface, waiting for someone curious enough to drain the water and see what lay at the bottom. Marcus took a breath and went inside. Inside, the phone was ringing. His sister. She called every Saturday, had called every Saturday for the past 20 years, making sure he was okay, making sure he hadn't isolated himself too much with his dead. "How are you?" she asked when he picked up. "I'm here," he said. "I'm tired, but I'm here." "That's enough," she said. "That's always been enough." After they hung up, Marcus made dinner. A simple meal, rice and vegetables and protein. He'd learned to cook after Catherine died, had learned to take care of himself in the ways she'd always taken care of him. He ate alone at the kitchen table, looking out the window toward the pool. The water was turning black as night fell. Stars were beginning to appear in the sky above it. And Marcus Webb, the man who'd wanted nothing but a quiet life and had instead become the guardian of a century-old secret, felt something like peace. Not the peace of ignorance, not the peace of not knowing, but the peace that comes from carrying something heavy and choosing to bear it anyway. The peace of having transformed pain into purpose. The peace of having let the past be excavated, examined, honored. The peace of having finally, after decades of silence, spoken.